This is the story of what happened when a young girl decided to trust her parents' traditional advice. Today's story is called The Woman Who Was Always First.
Season 1 of the story features 12 women trailblazers who changed the world. The story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, who strives to create workplaces where everyone feels empowered to bring their full, authentic selves to work. And now, onto the story.
The explosion ripped through the night. Her head spun, and she felt her father's arms wrap around her. The next thing she knew, her mother was throwing her into the car. Her father stepped on the gas, and the tires squealed. In the back seat, the little girl's eyes were wide. Her mother ran her fingers carefully through her hair, and then over her back. She checked her hands for signs of blood. They'd heard that shrapnel was in the bombs these days. She couldn't take any chances. The girl's father continued to drive, and now her mother was leaning into the back seat and running her hands over her daughter's back. It wasn't until they were a mile away that the ringing in her ears finally stopped. She could barely make out her mother's voice. Her mother was asking, was she okay? She nodded. In the front seat, her father was muttering under his breath as her mother started to run her hands all over him. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear. She wasn't in some war zone. It was just Birmingham, Alabama. The adults called it Bombingham. Segregation and racism were raging, and the young girl's father and mother did everything they could to shield her from it. But it still seeped through. It would have been easy for her parents to hate those who persecuted them, but they were far above it. Instead of giving way to hatred, they told their daughter not all white people were like this. In fact, there were many that were nice people. The girl's grandfather had been adopted and raised by a white family. They treated him like their own son. Her grandfather had set the tone for the entire family. And now the girl's father and mother laid out a simple plan for their daughter. There was only one path to safety: education. There were no other options, and they pushed the young girl to excel. Excel might be an understatement. They taught her to read and speak early, and enrolled her in the first grade when she was only 3. It didn't work, as the other children were brutal giants who towered over her. The family waited another year and tried again. This time, it worked, and the girl learned how to win inside the education system. She skipped first grade and went straight to second. One Sunday afternoon, when she was in the 6th grade, her father got a phone call and broke down into tears. When he put down the receiver, she asked him what was wrong. "Another bomb has gone off," he said. The 9-year-old girl heard the words her father spoke, but wasn't sure why he was telling her. "It's okay, Dad," she reassured him. "There were bombs going off all over Birmingham. Everybody knew it." Her father continued to speak slowly to her. Of course she knew this was going on. What was wrong? Most of the news like this didn't affect them. During the evenings, she would play the piano. Outside on the porch, her father would sit and listen with his gun in his lap. Mobs were a threat, and he had to protect the family. To her, this was just how life was. She studied and worked as hard as she could because it was the only path to safety. People in their town wanted people like her dead. There wasn't much she could do about that except listen to her parents. She got so good at playing the piano that she would entertain the entire community and play at their local church. But she still couldn't figure out why her father was taking such care to tell her about another bombing. Her father explained to her that this time was different. 2 of her friends had been near this bomb. It had gone off in a church just 2 miles from their home. Her 2 friends and 2 other girls were dead. The 9-year-old girl broke down into tears. She had heard about people being killed from all the violence and the mobs, but so far, they had never been her friends. Through her tears, her father looked at her sternly. He told her that this wasn't going to last forever, and that order and the rule of law would eventually come to their town. Her education, learning, and skills that she was working so hard on would be the armor that could save her. They would lift her up out of the war zone that was Birmingham. The young girl nodded her head and went back to practicing the piano. Her father went back to the porch with his gun. The murderers crushed her, and the girl's parents doubled down. They didn't have any money to leave, and education was the only way out. Her parents' advice was starting to work. She skipped the 7th grade, and when she was in the 8th grade, she was only 11 years old. 2 years later, her family left Birmingham. They moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where her father became a college administrator. After that, they moved to Denver, Colorado, where she attended her first integrated public school. By the time she was 15, she had completed her senior year of high school and her freshman year at the University of Denver. Her major was political science with a minor in Russian history. Like a rocket, she picked up a bachelor's degree in political science, then a master's from the University of Notre Dame, and finally, she earned her PhD from the University of Denver. After a childhood stained by fear, the world was opening up to her. So what was she going to do? Her first move was to accept a fellowship at Stanford University. The following year, she became a political science professor at Stanford. It was a rough first day on the job. She was promised that her civil-military relations course would be widely advertised, but only 6 students signed up. What was worse, her course was a late edition, so every classroom was already taken. The only option was to meet her 6 students in Stanford's old chemistry building. Because she was so young, her students didn't take her seriously. They tried to exploit her inexperience. They wanted to prove that they were smarter. It was a struggle to have an entire class against her, even if it was 6 students. Each night after class, she would read and study late into the night, ensuring that her students wouldn't win in their petty attempts at mutiny. In the mornings when she arrived at the old chemistry building, she was exhausted. As the quarter marched on, she got back on her feet. She had overestimated her students. Now it was painfully obvious who was the boss. Her intelligence by this point was undeniable, and she combined it with a charm that won over her cocky students. They all gave her enthusiastic evaluations, and the following year, 50 students signed up for the course. By her 3rd year at Stanford, her course was over-enrolled. She admitted 120 students into her class called The Role of Military in Politics. One day when she was teaching, a teacher's assistant interrupted her class. She was in the middle of a story and waved the TA off. But the young man was adamant. The class fell silent when he wouldn't leave. Yes, what is it? She asked. There was a phone call for her. Any chance you can take a message and I'll return it later? She asked, smiling. The class laughed. The TA's face turned red, and he started to stammer. It's, she laughed. You've already interrupted. You might as well tell us who it is. More laughter from the class. It's the President of the United States. A hushed silence fell across the class. She walked with the TA to the phone, the entire way wondering, is this some kind of joke? When she picked up the phone, she realized it wasn't a joke. It was a job offer. After a few conversations, she accepted President George H.W. Bush's offer to become director on his National Security Council staff in Washington, D.C. Her life would never be the same. The amazing woman who rose from Birmingham to the heights of power in Washington, D.C. is none other than Condoleezza Rice, or Condi as her friends call her. When Condi arrived in D.C., the reception was like her first class at Stanford. And just like that first class, she turned the skeptics into believers. After her tenure in D.C. during the term of Bush I, Condi returned to Stanford and became the provost and continued to teach. When you build and maintain your track record and reputation, the word gets around. Condi would soon get another call. This one was from George W. Bush, who was then the governor of Texas. George W. Bush asked Condi to join his foreign policy advisors team in his campaign for the presidency. Condi quit her job at Stanford and began working full-time on the Bush campaign. When Bush won the presidency in 2000, he named her as his national security advisor. She was the first woman to hold the position. During her tenure as national security advisor, Condi devoted her department to transformational diplomacy. Her aim was to build and sustain democratic states all around the world. So she moved American diplomats to countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Angola. She required each of them to become fluent in at least 2 foreign languages. Some have speculated that Condi could be a future vice presidential candidate, yet her passion continues to lie with her students at Stanford. In an interview with Oprah, she would say, "In a class of 20, there are always 2 or 3 for whom the lights go on. Those 2 or 3 students are the ones that Condi lives for." It's been said that she is the most influential woman in global politics. While her story is one of relentless, steady progress, it's also one of constant learning and teaching. When others tried to bring her back into politics, she declined, stating that, "My life is in Palo Alto. My future is with my students at Stanford and in public service on issues that I care about, like education reform." So we may never see Condi in a White House role again, but her legacy is going to carry on through the lives of her students. Condoleezza Rice's story is a breath of fresh air in our culture that can sometimes reject all tradition. It's easy to make a harsh critique of our education system. It's far more difficult to accept that parts of it are broken and that parts of it do work incredibly well. Condi trusted in her family, tradition, and education. Those pursuits helped her rise from a town where bombings were the norm to holding one of the highest political offices in the world. She now works tirelessly as a champion for education reform. If we all fully utilize, participate in, and work to revitalize our education system, there's no telling what we can achieve. Condi's story is proof that sometimes the traditional paths and the education system are our best bets. That's her story. What's yours going to be?
Thank you for listening to The Story. As a thank you, we have an exclusive giveaway for listeners of The Story, a chance to win 1 of 10 free tickets to Dreamforce, courtesy of our presenting sponsor, Salesforce. Salesforce is committed to supporting trailblazers like you. If you don't know Dreamforce, you are in for a treat. Dreamforce brings together thought leaders, industry pioneers, and customers for 4 high-energy days of learning, inspiration, equality, fun, and incredible concerts. You can head to thestorypodcast.com and enter to win today. That is thestorypodcast.com. Thank you again to our presenting sponsor, Salesforce, for helping promote equal opportunity and sharing these stories of trailblazers.
If you like this episode of The Story, please help spread these stories by telling one friend. Also, you can hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Story is created by our team here at The Mission. The Mission is your #1 source for accelerated learning. To get more stories and podcasts like this and our world-class newsletter, subscribe at themission.co. That's themission.co. See you next time.